As BMK mentioned, I'm based in Sausalito, San Francisco. Was down in Wellington, September of 2019, visiting one of my customers, Zero, at a previous job. I think BNZ was also a customer at that point for Spinnaker. Typically when I'm in sales, I'll wear my hat like this. So I used to be an engineer, so I'm gonna put it on normally. So I'm not in sales mode. I'm literally in just education, evangelism mode. I had to convince my boss to let me travel on the way to Turkey, which was the farthest way to get to Turkey. It would have been easier to just go direct, but here I am.
It's the most fun.
Spoke in New Zealand before, which was in Auckland. Didn't get a chance to speak in Wellington. I'm so glad to be back. I was supposed to fly down on middle of April in 2020, and the Prime Minister came on and said, if you arrive after Sunday, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. So I did not get on the plane. Here we are, almost 3 years later. So I lead sales and partnerships at a company called Spacelift. We're infrastructure as code collaboration platform, also CI/CD for infrastructure code that's specially built. Today I'm going to talk about 5 ways to manage Terraform at scale. I thought a lot about what I was going to present and specifically what I wasn't going to present. So hopefully you walk away with at least one thing that's new and exciting. So. Based in San Francisco, like to sail. I heard this was called Windy Wellington. I almost got blown away and lost my hat on the way here. But fun fact, I started as a customer at Black & Decker, went through the Stanley Black & Decker, Stanley Works merger, as a sysadmin infrastructure engineer back in 2005. So spent a lot of time racking and stacking servers, a lot of time using VMware, building a lot of like BCDR. I wrote a VMware book on edge computing for this thing called Work From Home, which is now kind of popular. So went from intern to lead architect at Black & Decker, then I spent some time doing consulting and solution engineering for VMware itself for about 5 years. And then someone let me on the dark side into sales, and I've been working with DevOps engineers since 2018 for a different company. So one is with Wavefront, which is now VMware Tanzu Observability. Now there's an open source project called Spinnaker, which came out of Netflix and Google. Another one was CI/CD for Salesforce, continuous orchestration with Opsera, and now I'm doing CI/CD for infrastructure code. So there's a theme kind of going along. So if someone has CI/CD for something else coming out, let me know. All right, so when do you want to use IaC? And if you're not sure when to use IaC, it's really easy. If you're deploying to the cloud. It doesn't matter if you're a one-person shop or a 10,000 or 50,000 person shop. Start putting things in as code, much like your applications are written as code. There are things now that are available that weren't available a few years ago, such as state management, which is a really kind of problem statement before. And we talk about infrastructure as code as a multiplayer game now. So before, if you're like doing a single player game on your phone, you don't need to share this thing called state with anyone. But sometimes you may put state in S3 bucket. It may not be encrypted, so then all your secrets get released. I've seen a lot of things where people just start scraping S3 buckets and things aren't encrypted or secure. That's happened a couple times. There's a bunch of other things we'll talk about, but there's a lot of ways to start very easily and more importantly free that you can do now that you don't have to do before it, because there's a lot better things at time to be spending on than worrying about how you're going to do infrastructure code or what I like to call like click ops. You can read this. Handful of problem statements. Cloud is complex. You have lots of container options. It's not just Kubernetes. There's been containers for a long time before that with things called Docker. Lots of things are not really automated, what I'm seeing. You got change management tracking, leadership likes that. A lot of people out there trying to do hacking and take down different companies or even open source projects. Previous presenter said there's a ton of shortage of just knowledge gap out there. You're getting asked to deploy Kubernetes and cloud, and the HR and leadership aren't training you on how to do this stuff. And the big companies are sucking up all the good talent, fortunately and unfortunately, which is a problem statement. And there's a lot of generation that the universities aren't teaching what's actually getting deployed now. So with that, so there's 5 things we're going to talk about. The first is use remote state. Do not store it locally, but put it somewhere in the cloud. This is an AWS example. Sorry for the Microsoft or Google folks. You can replace those logos and it probably works the same. It is okay to use local state when experimenting, but don't store secrets in there. Don't start sharing them across different people's laptops, forgetting to encrypt them, because you can just you can export all that and share it pretty easily across the internet. You can do things with as simple as S3 bucket encrypt it. You can use DynamoDB to do locking of that. When you start having 2, 3, 4 people maybe on the DevOps team, or maybe you're shifting left with more, allowing your software engineers to own their infrastructure, deploy to whenever they want, you have to start to share these state files. And I've seen mono repos that have hundreds or thousands, and there's some things out there just doing pull requests that work, but it starts to get very complex very quickly. Avoid manual state changes at all costs. Make sure you back it up, recover it. Treat everything as immutable. So avoid running Terraform locally and host it in a CI. I had a bunch of logos up here. I'll put the Sledgehammer Jenkins up here. It's a love-hate relationship. Everyone knows it and hates it, but it works. But typically the workflow is like this. You have a VCS provider, call it GitHub, Azure DevOps, GitLab, Atlassian, Bitbucket. Use a CI tool, hopefully, to run things like Terraform plans and Terraform applies, and then you're deploying something into the cloud. The Terraform providers can pretty much deploy any of the cloud services that are available. It doesn't matter if you're using, you can replace that with CloudFormation or Bicep or ARM or Pulumi or whatever's coming next. But this is a very simple setup. You get a lot of benefits. Audit controls. There's, we're in BNZ, this is a large bank. You probably have one of the big fours auditing you probably multiple times a year. Approval policies, avoiding version conflicts, just timing. People are working back in the office now, but remote teams, you just can't call someone up to say, hey, stop deploying your infrastructure because I want to deploy mine. But avoid implementing a full-grown homemade automation platform. Jenkins is nice, but it was built for CI, and let's keep it that way. It doesn't need to be a CD solution. There's a bunch of other things out there. Atlantis, HashiCorp has some products with Terraform Enterprise, Terraform Cloud. Spacelift has one. There's a few other ones out there. So if you look at, there's a bunch of boring features that your Terraform CI platform must have. And I'm pretty sure Jenkins doesn't have some of these. But make sure it's a reliable SaaS offering, includes a free trial. Make sure it integrates with all the VCS providers that I mentioned before. Make sure it can do simple things and knows what Terraform plans, applies, refreshes, destroys are. Make sure it's scalable. You never know if you're going to get a lot of Terraform deployments at once. Make sure it's probably written in an API first versus kind of using click. UI is nice for the first time, but make sure if you want to scale it, make sure it has a Terraform provider that can scale. Basic security essentials, RBAC, SAML, audit logging, etc. And notifications to either Teams, SMTP, Slack. There's things out there called module registry. So HashiCorp did a good job. They, I think before Terraform Enterprise or Terraform Cloud, they created a Terraform registry. By show that, how many people are using the HashiCorp's Terraform registry to store Terraform modules? How many have downloaded a Terraform provider? So you've used the Terraform module registry. So really they just help you abstract functionality from your infrastructure. So it makes them easily maintainable and usable. It auto-generates the documentation, version control, and you can share them. So typically on the right, you have the Terraform registry with all the different cloud providers. The gentleman before me said there, Microsoft has one that's a Terraform provider that wraps around Bicep and ARM. Then there's modules out there, and then developers will create modules or just reusable bits of code that you want to share among your different teams to create patterns. Programmatic IaC management. So Terraform relies on these plugins called providers. They each had a set of resources. They're pretty well documented on the registry page. Basically, they're just interacting with the API commands. So anything you can do from one of the cloud provider consoles, they're actually talking to the same APIs that you should be talking to as opposed to going through the UI. So very good state. You can see like different versions out there. When you test a new one, you're testing like backwards compatibility. And actually, once you start doing infrastructure code deployments through the UI, hopefully as you start to scale, it starts to become programmatic. Things like if you're using Okta or different SSO providers, users change, people change teams, and you don't want to have to go into Okta manually and wait for HR to deal with this stuff. Drift detection. And I say optional reconciliation. So what is drift? Difference between the desired and the actual state of your infrastructure, and there's actually good and bad drift. Everyone thinks everything is bad, but a couple examples are maybe you're set up with ASGs and you're auto scaling, or your DynamoDB's auto scaling. You probably just want to get notified about it, ignore it. You probably don't want it to be auto scaled all the time, but when the holidays come up around between like Thanksgiving and Christmas, you may want to auto scale for the e-commerce teams and then bring it back down in like January. Bad drift, changes of security groups, someone go mucking around in the UI, changing IAM roles. It happens more than you probably want it. Someone says, I just need to do this now because it's a ticket, an issue, it's on the weekend, and I just need to fix it, but they never go back and don't fix it, or they don't put it back in as infrastructure as code. So notify, you can either do manual remediation, you probably don't want to just do an automated remediation. And then data breaches, when maybe someone changes an S3 bucket, or you could deploy an S3 bucket that's unencrypted. That's probably something you want to prevent, detect, and maybe auto-remediate automatically. Again, the benefits, you want to detect these changes, you want to get alerted, you want high agility, you want to just reduce risk and reduce costs, which are two big tick boxes on boardrooms right now. So in summary, use remote state, use the Terraform CI platform, use a model registry, use a Terraform provider, use drift detection. You don't need to do all these baby steps. Probably want to start in the top left and then kind of work your way through. And then the last thing is, I don't think everyone's ever going to do this 100%, but if you can, avoid ClickOps. I know AWS has like a day one culture where this is kind of embedded in their culture of turn off the AWS console to people that don't need it. There's no reason to really go in there. And whatever you're using, whatever tool you pick, it's calling the same APIs as the console. So use infrastructure code, make no exceptions, no manual creation or changes of AWS or Kubernetes resources ever, never. Try to apply this rule right now. It's going to save you much later on. This is what a sample company's directory would look like in their VCS provider. So in this case, they have 3 environments: sandbox, staging, and production. Inside of production, they have Terraform state files for different services they use. So in this case, they might be using AWS, Okta, Kubernetes, Vault, maybe their application or example services in there. And then they have, everything is kind of parameterized down. So if you make a change, you can push that out across multiple environments. And this is kind of what the Git flow looks like from a service repository through using different teams, different services to be able to create those different Terraform files programmatically as things get updated. Not saying you only need 3, but this is probably a decent practice that you might want to implement. I've seen some companies only use production, which is fine, but as you get into large organizations, you may want to, if you can afford it, have a sandbox, staging, and production. I've seen some companies have 8, 10, 15 environments, depending on maybe ERP systems that you're using. So sandbox, let everyone have access, do everything you want to do in there, break things, learn, but know that your changes might not get saved long term. Staging, once you've learned what you're doing in the sandbox, push it in as code. Production releases should have some approvals potentially gated to them or notifications. And then production access is restricted. Infrastructure must be deployed as code in the tooling. So I'll put my sales hat back on for a moment. So thank you for letting me come down here. Spacelift, we're a sophisticated, compliant infrastructure delivery platform for multiple IaC technologies. We just came out with Ansible today, so we are backed by Open Policy Agent. Everything is built on top of open source technology. We are not an open source tool, but we do have a free tier to implement some of these different pieces. This pretty much covers most of the market, and we are working on Bicep and ARM soon. And this is what I see as the evolution of IaC. So from 2014, Terraform open source released, TerraGrunt came out 2 years later. A year after that, Terraform Enterprise was released, and then Atlantis came out Terraform Cloud, and now Spacelift, and a few other what we call TACOS providers, or Terraform Automation Collaboration Services. Here's some resources if you want to read. We got a bunch of great blogs from practitioners from different users around the world. I'm not sure if anyone from Vend is here, but we do have one New Zealand customer called Vend, which is acquired by Lightspeed. I am down here to try to build out that organization and potentially hire some folks. Thank you very much. Thanks for being here.